Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our April 8th webinar on red flags in your governing documents. My name is Alina Gilbert. I will be presenting this amazing webinar today. Glad you were able to join us. And of course, as always, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the class, we are going to go through a few housekeeping things, so feel free to tune this out if you already have it memorized. You'd think I would have it memorized by now, doing it all the time, but I still don't have it memorized. Every so often I got to peek at my notes. But at any rate, so the bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint, and then off kind of to the left in the center is me. Hello. Off on the right side, you will see a little chat icon. That's what you're going to click on and enter any questions you have as we go through this webinar. I do wait until the end of the webinar before answering the questions to make sure we have enough time to go through all the materials. So if you're having any audio or any video problems as we're doing the webinar, there's a little icon on the bottom that says audio or video problems. Click on that. It'll take you through a few steps and hopefully resolve the issue. You will be receiving 1 CMCA credit for attending this webinar. Of course, you need to stay on the whole time, but you will be receiving 1 credit for it. It will get emailed to you within the next 24 to 48 hours max. Do me a huge favor, and when you get the email, please save a copy of the actual certificate that's in the body of your email. Please save it as a document because it does kind of magically disappear after about 30 days. So if you just leave it in your inbox or put it in a folder, it will be going away in 30 days, and then you're going to need another copy of it. So please just save that as a document somewhere in your system so that you can have it. As a reminder, we are recording today's presentation. It will be available on our YouTube channel probably by tomorrow or the day after at the latest. Anyone can access it and watch it. The only thing is, if you're watching the recording, we cannot provide CMCA credits. You only get credits for attending this one, the live version of it. And finally, last but not least, at the end of the webinar, you will have a survey pop up on the screen as it always does. As always, if you have time and inclination, we appreciate any and all feedback you provide. I don't consider it good or bad feedback. It's just information that helps us improve our presentations and our topics moving forward. So please feel free to put whatever you're thinking in there if you have time. So any feedback is appreciated feedback. And then moving forward, let's go ahead and get started with the actual presentation. So just so you know, for the purposes of this class, what I'm really going to focus on is your declaration. So it's the same thing as your decks, your CC&Rs, your covenants. It's all the same thing. So we're going to focus on that document. We're going to look at your articles of incorporation and the bylaws and talk about some red flags that you may see in each of them. We'll also talk about whether the red flags necessarily mean, oh my God, we have to rewrite or amend our document. They don't all mean that. They don't all require amendments. Some of them don't. So we'll talk about that as well so that you can have a better idea of, can we just know these exist and move on, or is there anything else we can do besides amending? So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the declaration. And the first thing I want to talk about is developer language. When developers create a new common interest community, they create the original sets of documents. Those documents are drafted by the developer's attorneys. They are not working for the benefit of the HOA. They are working for the benefit of the developer, the declarant. And so the documents are drafted to favor, guess who? The developer, of course, and also to protect the developer. So if you're working with your original set of documents, you will probably see numerous references to the developer, the declarant, declarant rights, annexation rights of the declarant, powers of the declarant, voting of declarant, phase 1, phase 2. So all sorts of different things relating to the declarant. Once the declarant is gone, that language becomes obsolete and is not needed anymore. Now, the question typically is, Alina, do we have to amend just to remove this? And I would say, no, don't waste your money on legal fees to rewrite a declaration for the sole purpose of removing developer language. It's not worth it. It just sits there, and it might confuse some people. It might be annoying to others, but it's not a violation of the law to keep it in there. So I would not recommend spending money to rewrite or amend just for this reason. Although if you are rewriting or amending for some other reason, certainly this is something you would want to address, and you would want to take that out of your updated documents. The next thing is unachievable amendment requirements. So we're talking about usually homeowner approval, mortgagee approval. Sometimes we see developer approval. Older documents especially tend to have higher amendment requirements. So it's not unusual to see 90% of the homeowners have to approve. 100% of the mortgagees have to approve. Now, who's a mortgagee? Well, the mortgagee is the bank that lent money to someone to purchase a unit in the community. It's the bank to which that owner writes their mortgage check every month. Or if they've sold the mortgage to another bank, it's that bank that gets the mortgage payment. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to get a bank to approve any kind of an amendment or to get the mortgagee approval, but I will tell you it is next to impossible to do that. So anytime you see a mortgagee approval requirement, just know that it's not something that's going to happen. So you're going to have to work around it. We'll talk real quick about how we work around it. But as an example, I will tell you, I worked with a community probably about 8 years ago now, and it was a small community. It was only 12 units. They had language that required approval from 100% of the first mortgagees. So that would have been 12 banks. The board did not want to utilize any alternative method. They thought that, if we just kind of put our minds to it and work really hard through legal, we will get the 12 banks, or however many banks there are for 12 units, to approve this amendment. We worked on it for 2 years, and I will tell you, after 2 years, we got 5 responses. That's it. So not even half. So when I tell you don't bother and that you're not going to get what you need, I mean it, because you really won't. So what happens if we do have mortgagee approval requirement, or what happens if we have 90% homeowner approval requirement? What happens if we have developer approval requirement and the developer's gone? They've built the community out. They've been gone for 20 years, doesn't even exist anymore. What do we do with that? The short answer is, in most cases, that you're going to go through a process that is statutory, and we call it the court petition process. It's authorized by CIWA, which is the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, the statute that governs HOAs in Colorado. And it essentially requires associations to jump through a few hoops and to get approval from at least 1/2 of the homeowners required in the declaration. So let's say you have an approval requirement of 90% of your homeowners. If you're going to petition the court, you would still need about at least 45% of your homeowners to say yes. Okay, so it's half of what the declaration requires. And you don't necessarily need any mortgagee approval or even developer approval before you petition. And assuming we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's, and we do not get 1/3 or more of owners filing objections, or 1/3 or more of the banks filing objections, or the developer filing an objection, a judge will be required to approve the amendment. They don't get to look at it and decide if they like it or not. That's beyond their purview. The statute requires them to approve it if we've check marked all the little boxes that we have to check mark. So ultimately, that's the way you get around it. Sometimes I have boards that say, well, we just want to amend one little thing and we'll keep the amendment requirement as it currently is with, the mortgagees and the high owner approval. And I say, well, okay, but just keep in mind that, next time you want to amend, you're going to have to go through the court process again. And every time you go through the court process, that could be anywhere from like $6,000 to $9,000. Do you really want to keep spending that kind of money instead of nipping it in the bud right away? So that's my recommendation. Some of you, I can tell, I can hear you. Some of you are thinking, Alina, this is stupid because we know that Kiowa has a cutoff of 67% as a maximum owner approval requirement for a declaration amendment. So this is dumb. It would default to 67%. You are correct. Most amendments would default to 67%, but that's not going to take care of your mortgagee approval requirement. And 67% is still a pretty darn high threshold to reach in a larger community. Even with, say, 200 homes, 67% is going to be tough. So don't assume that you don't need to change your amendment requirements. Our amendment requirements could be as low as a majority of all. That's an easier threshold. But at any rate, that is a red flag to be aware of. Again, do we change our declaration for this thing alone? Probably not, because you want to wait until you have something else really that's bigger and better and that really requires an amendment. But these are all things that you would probably want to change along with the other issues. Another red flag, you have an old set of documents, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Keep in mind, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, Kiowa, became effective July 1, 1992. You've got a community that was created before that date. Its documents were drafted before that date. And so the documents were drafted before the laws that govern HOAs even came into existence. So you can pretty much imagine how outdated that language would be. So again, a red flag, just because it's old, again, not necessarily a trigger for a rewrite, but it might be a trigger for you to have your legal counsel for the association to review the documents and kind of tell you, here's all the stuff that's wrong with it, because there's probably a lot of things in there. So, I'm already out of breath. All right. Now let's talk about provisions that do not comply with current laws. Why wouldn't they comply? Well, because some declarations were drafted before the laws were created. We've consistently seen legislation in prior years that impact associations. So they keep changing the game on us, right? And we keep seeing different things coming up. Just a few examples, I listed those for you. Signage. First we could do whatever we wanted. Then we could not prohibit political signage. Then now we can't at all govern signage based on its content. So we can't even address political signage now. So there's, all sorts of things are happening in our state. And those are impacting what associations can and can't do. Construction materials. Okay, we can't prohibit Firewise building materials now, right? Nobody even knows what that is. Can't prohibit xeriscape. Have to allow AstroTurf, that's why I still call it AstroTurf, in the backyards. Satellite dishes, that's the FCC, can't prohibit them, can't have rules that make it more difficult or that take up more time, that delay the process, that increase the cost, any of that stuff. So there's a lot of things out there. And solar panels, I don't know how many of you are following legislature right now. We've got a bill out there now that is looking to protect portable solar generation devices, and that may pass soon too. So now we might have another change to our solar panel laws. EV charging stations, interest on delinquent assessments used to be 21% as the cap, now we're at 8%. So things change. Now, just because your declaration does not comply with the law or even conflicts with the law, does that in and of itself require the association to amend? No, there's no legal requirement that you amend to bring your documents into compliance with the law. We are not California yet. California actually requires that. Their attorneys make a lot more money on this stuff. So you don't have to amend to come into compliance. But here's what you do have to do. One, you have to know that you can't enforce certain provisions in your documents. You got to know which ones those are, and which means you got to keep track. Two, you have to be able to explain to your homeowners who call and complain that my neighbor has a sign up that's very offensive to me, and why are you not requiring them to take it down because our declaration says no signs? And then you have to explain, well, you know, the laws changed. They supersede what's in our documents. We're not allowed to prohibit signs, blah, blah, blah. So is that something you really want to have to deal with? Again, food for thought. I had a board the other day tell me, well, look, since the law's changing all the time, what's the point of amending our covenants in order to come into compliance? Because next year something else is going to change. And you know, that is probably true. At the rate we're going, it seems like something's changing every year, some years more than others. But ultimately, the question is, how out of date do you want your documents to be? And do you want all your provisions being contrary to the law, or just kind of like one or two? Easier to keep track of one or two provisions than basically saying our whole set of restrictions in our covenants can't be enforced. So again, it's a preference. It's not a requirement. Don't let anyone tell you that you have to amend to come into compliance. You don't. All right. Whew, let's keep going here. Unclear maintenance provisions. Any of you ever had experience with that? Nah, we've never seen any unclear maintenance provisions, right? Some maintenance provisions can be clarified through resolution. If we have ambiguous language, such as exterior building surfaces. I see that a lot, especially with like townhomes. Association shall maintain the exterior building surfaces. Well, who wants to tell me whether that means we're just painting because that's just the surface of the exterior, or we're actually going to be replacing the actual wood planks on the building? I don't know. Could be either one. I don't know what an exterior building surface is. Is it just the part I touch, or is it the whole plank? I don't know. So these types of provisions that are completely unclear, they can be clarified through a resolution of the board, and where the board basically says, we have this language, this is how we choose to define it, and this is how we will interpret it. You can lawfully do that, and that's okay. Now, let's look at a different kind of a conundrum when it comes to maintenance provisions. Again, really, this comes into play with a lot of townhomes and patio homes. You've got a provision that says basically a homeowner maintains the improvements within their lots. Association maintains common area. So the first problem is, where are the lot lines? Sometimes it's not easy to tell. We can't tell usually by looking at the plat map. Some communities, plat maps are done very well, where they actually show the footprint of the home, and then they also show you like how many feet from the side to the boundary line. It's rare, but I've seen it. In most cases, we can't even really tell. So what happens if we got that kind of language and we don't know where the lot ends and common area begins? Or better yet, what if we have language where we can tell that the lot line is in the middle of the driveway. So a part of the driveway is inside the lot and a part of the driveway is outside the lot. So if we interpret the language the way it's written, which we kind of have to, homeowner has to maintain that portion of the driveway that's inside the lot line. Association maintains the portion of the driveway outside the lot line. And if we need the full driveway replaced, you go figure. That's a problem. That is a huge problem. And ultimately, our associations, our boards are required to follow the instruction in the covenants. We don't get to look at it as a board and say, I don't like this. This is stupid. I mean, we can say that, but when we don't follow it, there's a liability exposure there for the board and for the association. So you are much better off actually following it. And so with those types of situations, you cannot fix that through a resolution or a policy or a rule. You would need to amend in that case if you want to fix that kind of maintenance provision. So we could say the driveways are all homeowner, regardless of where it's located, or driveways are all association, regardless of where it's located. But to do that, we got to go through an amendment. So that's something that you really wouldn't be able to change without an amendment. Utilities, sometimes utilities are completely unclear, and other times we have utilities where the homeowner maintains anything that services their unit exclusively, regardless of where it's located. And a lot of times people like that, but then you kind of start thinking about it. Say you're in a high-rise building and you got a pipe, a water pipe that goes behind my perimeter drywall, goes down, passes another unit, but it still only services my unit. So I got to go in down there through my neighbor's unit to fix the pipe that only services my unit. Practically, it's a nightmare. So all sorts of problems with both unclear maintenance provisions, but also kind of impossible to follow, impractical maintenance provisions. And of course, we have to deal with that or we amend. Insurance, kind of similar to the maintenance. So sometimes the association has to insure everything. As you know, insurance ain't getting no cheaper for us. And as premiums continue to increase and skyrocket, especially in mountain communities, associations are trying to push more insurance obligations onto homeowners so that they can save money on those premiums, so they can insure less. Can't do that without a declaration amendment, right? Because you've got to change what's in the current declaration. We see problems when association maintains components but doesn't insure them. So we maintain the roof of the townhome, but we don't have insurance on it. So if a homeowner is underinsured, who's going to pay for the roof replacement? Is it the homeowner or is it the association? Or what happens if a homeowner submits a claim and it's denied? So another problem, who pays for it then? Is it the association because we have the maintenance obligation? All really bad situations that we don't want to be in. And unfortunately, you know, most associations don't realize they have these issues until it's too late and they already have them. And then only then do they realize, darn, probably should have looked at this before and tried amending it. All right, declaration assessments. Oh, by the way, if you're looking at your copy of what you received, you're going to see something, you're going to see like insurance blurb down there. I took it out because it was the exact repeat of the insurance blurb we just talked about. I just didn't catch it in time before it got sent to you. So just cross that off. That was all Alina's fault. She did not realize she put it in there twice, probably because I love insurance so much. All right, assessments. We typically see or utilize the Kiowa budget ratification process, but that doesn't mean that works in all cases, because sometimes you've got owner approval for any and all increases to assessments. Some approval requirements are extremely high, which almost guarantee associations cannot obtain the requisite approval to increase assessments. So how do they pay for things? Everything, the price of everything is going up. What do you do if you have to get homeowner approval every single time you need more money. That could be a huge problem. Sometimes we need a provision allowing associations to charge back assessments based on benefit. If the work was only for the benefit of one unit or a couple of units, sometimes it makes sense that it gets charged back to those owners, but you might not have that language. So those are things that if we wanted to change them, that would have to be through a declaration amendment. It could not be through any kind of a policy, rule, or resolution. All right, no teeth to enforce. So I suspect you've all run into these annoying situations where, given the changes in the law, your community is having a really hard time addressing violations that have to do with like nuisances and repeat offenses, right? Because we really can't do much about that anymore. So what we try to do with a lot of these is try to use other types of remedies that your declarations give us. For example, suspension of the right to use recreational facilities, suspension of your voting rights, self-help rights, for vehicles towing, things like that. But the problem is we don't have these rights inherently. We don't have them through a statute. Okay, so if we don't have that right in our declaration, we don't have that right. And in this day and age where our hands are so tied when it comes to, being able to really go after repeat offenders or nuisance offenders. So we have a barking dog, dog's too loud, barks all the time, barks at night. Technically, it stops barking at some point, and when it stops, the violation's cured. So when it starts barking again, we got to start from scratch. So all we're ever going to get to, right, is that courtesy notice. We're not going to fine. We're not going to be able to turn it over to legal to initiate, a lawsuit. We won't get to that because they will have cured it every single time. So that's a concern. So we do try to rely on some other teeth, so to speak, that declarations have for us. But if your declaration doesn't have any of this stuff, then there is really not much you can do other than amend, because you can't give yourself those rights through rules or policies or resolutions. All right. And this is one I see a lot. The declaration does not serve the current needs of the community. The older your covenants are, the less likely they are to truly serve the community, because let's face it, standards change. What was acceptable 30 years ago may not be acceptable now. All these things happen. So I'll give you a great example of restrictions that are outdated. I was recently looking through a set of covenants, and in the restrictions it said, these are older ones, of course, said no trucks. Well, that includes pickup trucks. And back when these documents were written, we didn't see pickup trucks in every driveway. That wasn't a thing. We saw maybe station wagons. We didn't see trucks. And so back then that could have been an appropriate restriction, but now every other home in this community has a pickup truck. And technically those pickup trucks are not allowed. So again, the board found itself between a rock and a hard place because they don't want to enforce this. Half the board have trucks. But at the same time, they have to enforce it because that's their duty. And if they don't enforce it, they have a liability exposure. So how do we fix this? The only way we're going to fix this is to amend. You can't fix it otherwise. Otherwise, we also see situations where we have a problem, but there's nothing in the declaration addressing it because the declaration is so old and outdated. So, for example, electric vehicles. I mean, we have protections for electric vehicles, but those were never addressed in older documents. We don't have language in a lot of older documents that governs even marijuana, for example, right? The odor. There's a lot of things as communities grow, their needs change, and the original documents haven't changed. So they're not growing with the association. And as a result, we end up with a set of documents that don't really address the needs. So those are also red flags to look for. And if you're finding it more and more difficult to be able to address problems in the community, and it's not because of the law, it's because there's just nothing in our documents, that's a red flag for you. That's a red flag. Speaking of red flags. All right, we're going to move on now to other documents, and we're going to start off with the articles. Oh, my hair's doing something. Articles of incorporation. So let's do this. So articles of incorporation. It's a small document, as you know. The purpose is really to create the corporate entity, and there's not a whole lot that needs to be in there. But probably the main reason that I recommend amending articles of incorporation is to add the limitation of personal liability provision. The Nonprofit Act allows associations to protect their boards from liability unless, of course, the board acted criminally, willfully, wantonly, but it allows the boards to be protected when they act in good faith, even if their decisions aren't correct. But the key here is you have to have this provision in your articles of incorporation. If you don't, you can't take advantage of it. It's kind of weird that the law was drafted in that way, because honestly, why can't it just be that the statute says we're protected? I don't know, but we have to have it in our articles of incorporation. And when I review a set of articles, if I don't see it, I will tell boards, you should consider an amendment just to add this provision, because you're not getting paid enough, to put yourself out there on the line like that. A couple other things is dissolution. Nonprofit Act requires that dissolution be addressed in the articles of incorporation. I don't always see it. Do we amend just for that? No. But if you are amending, you probably want to add that in. Also, range of directors. So let me explain this one. If everything is done the way it should be, what you would see is the articles of incorporation, when it talks about directors, it would say, maybe the initial number of directors is 3. However, it can be any number between 3 and 7, as more fully set forth in the bylaws. Okay, so it sets this acceptable range of board members. When you go to the bylaws will say the number of directors is 5, for example. Now, there are times in every community where we don't have enough volunteers and we're not going to be able to get 5. There are times when there's a lot of volunteers and we really want to go up to 7. So the communities fluctuate as far as homeowner participation, and boards can amend their bylaws to increase or decrease the number of directors without having to go through homeowner approval, unless it's specifically required that to change the number of directors, you got to go through homeowner approval. You usually don't see that. So in most cases, boards can change the number of directors in their bylaws. Now, if we don't have the range in the articles of incorporation, that could ultimately mean if everyone resigns from the board except me, I'm going to amend the bylaws to say we only get 1 director, and that director is me. And that would not be a good situation, right? And also, I could say I want all my friends to be on the board, and there's like 13 of them, so I'm going to amend the bylaws. and say that the number of board members is now 13. We don't want any board having that much power. And so the checks and balances here is, although the board can amend the number of directors, they have to comply with what's in the articles. Now, when there is a conflict between your articles of incorporation and your bylaws, your articles actually prevail, much to some people's surprise. The articles are higher up on this hierarchy of governing documents than the bylaws. So that's why the articles give you an acceptable range, and then the board, the actual number, is set forth in the bylaws with some leeway for the board to actually be able to adjust it, but within that range, so it's not abused. That's really how it's supposed to be. Is it really how it is? No. But if you've got a set of articles that just say, oh, the number of board members is 3, or the number of board members is any number set forth in the bylaws, that could be problematic because of what we just talked about. So keep that in mind as you are looking through your documents. All right, enough about the articles. They're short. That's about it. Let's talk about bylaws. We got a few things to talk about with bylaws. All right, quorum. Let's talk about quorum. It's too high or too low. Anybody have trouble year after year after year getting quorum of homeowners to show up for the annual meeting? If that's the situation, then most likely your quorum requirement is way too high. It's way too high. If you consistently have issues meeting quorum. Now, it may not seem high, it may be like 20%, but if you can't meet that year after year, it's too high for this community. So that's a problem. Sometimes quorum requirements could be too low. In other words, it is 2% of the community, or I've seen quorum as whoever shows up. There's no specific requirement like a ceiling or a floor for where quorum can be, right? So there's no acceptable range. Your bylaws could literally say quorum is 90% of the community, or quorum is whoever shows up. Doesn't matter. So that, we obviously don't want to go too far in any extreme. We want to have it high enough so it's not just, 2 people making decisions, but we don't want it to be so high that we can never meet it and never have a properly qualified board or an election or be able to make decisions. So you want it somewhere reachable, so to speak. So if you've got quorum problems, probably want to amend, especially if you're not able to get quorum at your annual meetings. That is a huge exposure to liability, because essentially you got boards that aren't really properly constituted, because you got basically people being appointed year after year by board members who were appointed themselves, and no true election has taken place. And that's going to be subject to challenge, could be subject to challenge. And so you really want to protect communities from that, and you need to try and lower quorum. But Alina, you're thinking, don't we need to meet quorum in order to lower quorum? Yes, you do. But here's kind of how we do that is you need, of course, to reach quorum in order to lower the quorum requirement through an amendment. You can only do it through an amendment of the bylaws. And depending on what your approval requirement is for the bylaws. But let's say you've got a majority of those voting as long as a quorum of owners are voting. That's standard. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. So you've got a quorum of homeowners, and at least a quorum of homeowners have to vote. And then a majority of those who are voting have to vote in favor of the amendment. Now, let's say your quorum is 50%, and you're not going to get 50% of all your homeowners showing up. You have a 400 home community, you're not going to get 200 people showing up. It's just not going to happen, right? Unless maybe you're raising assessments. And even then, it's probably not likely to happen. So what do we do if we need to amend to lower quorum? Well, what we would probably do is create the amendment and do a vote using a mail ballot. With a mail ballot, we can keep the voting period open 60 days, which is much better than a one and done. You either you show up to a meeting or you don't. So you have a 60-day window within which we can knock on doors, we can send reminder emails, we can call, we can do whatever. You be as creative as you want to try and solicit ballots back. And so that's really kind of the thought behind that, is we could do it that way. And then hopefully we have enough time to be able to get a quorum of homeowners to respond and approve the amendment, so that moving forward, we don't have to deal with this problem. Okay. No director qualifications. So that's one where you just have a provision that says the board shall consist of 3 individuals. And that's all it says. So there is nothing in any statute that impacts associations that says board members have to be homeowners, board members have to be in good standing, board members have to be residents. That's not statutory. So the only place you could have these kinds of qualifications are in the bylaws. And that would require an amendment to the bylaws. And if you are a post-Kiowa community and you're trying to amend your bylaws to add qualifications for your board members, you are required to obtain homeowner approval. It can't just be the board approving that kind of a change. You will need to go through a homeowner approval process. But if you have no qualifications, hypothetically, the garbage man could run for the board, and if they're elected, guess what? He is on the board now. Doesn't matter if he lives there, if he owns a unit there, if he has any interest whatsoever in the community, anyone can run, anyone can be elected. You know what else? There's not even an age limit or floor when it comes to being on the board. So you could have a 5-year-old elected to the board. You could have an 18-year-old who knows everything elected to the board. Wouldn't matter. They could do it. So you definitely want to have some qualifications in your bylaws. And if you don't right now, again, the only way to add those in is through an amendment. Another red flag could be director proxies. So when it comes to homeowner proxies and annual meetings, we always say you got to let them use proxies. That's their right, blah, blah, blah. It's not the same when we talk about boards at board meetings or directors at board meetings. Directors do not have a statutory right to issue proxies if they can't attend a board meeting, unless that right is specifically set forth in the bylaws. So if your bylaws are silent and don't contain any language with respect to, directors being able to send or to issue proxies, they can't do it. Okay. And if you want to have that authority, that would have to come from an amendment. That is not something that you could allow through any kind of a policy or rule. All right, meetings. There's a lot of requirements in Kiowa when it comes to meetings and notice of meetings. We have the 10 to 50 day rule. It has no less than 10, no more than 50 days before the meeting. It has to be either snail mailed or hand delivered to each owner. You have to physically post notice in a conspicuous location. I mean, we got a lot of different stuff in Kiowa when it comes to meetings. So sometimes we see documents that really don't follow Kiowa and have different standards. So for example, I oftentimes see older documents that say notice must be 15 to 60 days out for a homeowner meeting. Well, you have to do it at least, you can't do more than 50 days because Kiowa says no more than 50 days. You can do the 15 days because that still complies with Kiowa, but you can't go up to 60 days. So again, those are just the types of things that if you're not amending them, you need to be aware that they exist and they're wrong and what the law actually requires you to do. So red flag. If you've got required committees that are listed, most often I see a nominating committee, but you don't use those types of committees, you really need to kind of delete reference to that because right now you've got a requirement that you use a nominating committee and you're not doing that. So technically you're not complying with the bylaws and you are facing a liability exposure for failing to comply. So if you have a lot of language with respect to certain kinds of committees that have to be used that aren't being used, that probably needs to get deleted out and amended out from your bylaws. Annual meeting language. How many of you have bylaws that say the annual meeting will take place on the third Wednesday of November every year? Something like that. Well, you know, that's all well and good, except we may not be able to do it on the third Wednesday of November every year. You know, that may be the day before Thanksgiving, and we're not going to hold a meeting the day before Thanksgiving. You just don't know, right? So technically, you would not be in violation of your governing documents if you held a meeting at a different time than what is required. Do a lot of associations have this language? Yes. Do a lot of associations ignore this language? Yes. And do most associations get away with it? Yes. But it just takes one disgruntled homeowner who is upset with the board that wants to stick it to them, that's going to find this provision and be like, oh, no, you have not been complying with our bylaws. Every election we had is void. We don't have a properly constituted board. All your decisions are void, blah, 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 blah. And now you're stuck dealing with them. And then it becomes worse when they get an attorney and the attorney's like, yeah, none of your decisions are valid. And now you got to deal with all of that. Why? Same thing with the meeting agenda. Some bylaws will have a very specific agenda requirement. You've probably seen those as well. You know, call to order, fine. Establish quorum, fine. Must read meeting minutes from last year. Must do this, must do this. And half of the things we don't even do at an annual meeting, but all of a sudden we have to do them now because that's what's required in the bylaws. Again, very problematic, definitely a red flag. Do most associations ignore this? Yes. And do most get away with it? Probably. But again, it only takes one really disgruntled owner to really make things difficult for an association when they have this kind of a language. My preference is typically to amend it out. In a lot of cases, that can be done without homeowner approval as well. A lot of cases. All right. What else? Non-compliance with laws. So we kind of touched on this a little bit with other things we talked about, but so, you know, one thing I see a lot of is who can call a special meeting of homeowners. And it says that, for example, owners signing, 25% or more of all owners signing a petition. Well, that's an older kind of document provision we see, but Kiowa caps it at 20%. So you can't require 25%, even if your documents say so. Do we need to amend for that reason? No, but do you need to know that it can't be more than 20%? Yes, you do. Director removal, Kiowa's very clear. If you're having a director removal vote meeting, it's 67% of those who are voting at that meeting, as long as a quorum of owners are present. That's what it takes to remove a board member. It doesn't matter what your bylaws or other documents say. So if you've got something other than that, that says 90% of all owners must vote in favor of the removal, that's void. So you got to know that if you're not amending to come into compliance, you got to know that those provisions are not going to be enforceable. Again, does law require us to amend the documents to come into compliance? No, you don't. You're not in violation of anything by failing to amend, but you would be in violation if you try to enforce the bylaws as they are written. So that's really the distinction there. And then kind of finally, corporate seal. Older documents do contain a corporate seal language provision, and there's no corporate seals anymore for us at least. And so that language is superfluous. My guess is nobody uses it. And if your corporate seal language is written in a manner that says, you must use a corporate seal, again, we're probably not complying with it. Probably nobody cares except that one disgruntled homeowner who's going to be a pain in our side, who's going to make a stink over it at some point. So, these are all kind of red flags to pay attention to as kind of you look through your documents. And if you're not sure whether you have serious problems with your documents, I always recommend going to the association's legal counsel, seeing if they'll do a review for you of the documents and kind of list out any problems they see so that the board can be aware of kind of where their documents stand and whether or not they should be amending them, or if they can adopt resolutions or policies or rules to address the concerns. All right. So we got 9 minutes for questions. Let us go through the questions. Can AstroTurf be in the front yard if there is no policy against it in the HOA? So maybe if the HOA does not have any rules or guidelines that addresses landscaping whatsoever, the argument is you don't have any prohibition on it. If you have something that says, though, that any modification to the exterior of the home or the landscaping has to have approval, then they would still need to go through approval to see if they can get that AstroTurf put on their front yard. And then the board could say, or the ARC committee could say no. But again, if you don't have rules against it, why would you not allow it, right? All right. We are in the process, and quite frankly, enough errors in the declaration that I am at a loss, where condo owners need more clarification on what we need. Please deal with condos for the insurance issue. So depending on when your condominiums were created, if you were created before July 1, 1992, so pre-Kiowa, insurance is whatever your documents say. Kiowa does not apply to you with respect to insurance requirements. So if you want to amend the declaration to reduce the association's requirement of insurance, you can do that, assuming you get the homeowner approval. If you have a post-Kiowa community, that's a different story. Kiowa says association must insure the actual condominium units minus finished surfaces and owner installed improvements. So that means we got to insure the drywall, we got to insure the subflooring, the windows, originally installed fixtures, but we don't have to insure things like paint, wallpaper, carpet, upgraded cabinets and countertops, upgraded ceiling fans, or anything that the homeowner installed that wasn't originally installed by the developer. So that's the difference between condo that's pre and post Kiowa. And so if your declaration requires that you insure everything in a condo community, regardless of when it was created, you're going to have to comply with that. And the only way to change that is to amend. All right. Is it correct that non-consensual vehicle towing must meet the PUC regulations. It has to comply with the statute, the portion of the statute that impacts common interest communities. So there's a whole big giant statute that deals with towing. Most of it is geared towards the towing companies. There are portions that are geared towards the associations that require a whole bunch of stuff like specific signage. And I mean, it's really detailed. Like it has to be a certain height off the ground. It has to be a minimum, of a certain size. It has to be in English and in Spanish. There's a lot of requirements. So the association would have to comply with all of that. And usually the towing companies help you. And then the towing companies have to comply with all the other regulations. So that's generally how it works. All right. I thought we could reopen a violation in a 12-month period and step it to the next level. Not anymore. If a violation, especially now, if a violation's been cured, it's done. You got to start from scratch again. And also now we have a requirement of 2 30-day demand letters that have to go out, and they can't be more than 7 days apart. So you can't write the first letter and then take a hiatus on it and a year later write the second letter. They got to be 7 days apart. So unfortunately, that is not really the situation anymore. Things are much more complicated at this point. Can a fire suppression system in a townhome or condo be considered a utility for the purposes of having the owners be responsible for maintenance and repair? Yeah, I would typically consider that a utility or equipment. But again, it just depends on how the documents are written when we talk about, maintenance. Let's see, one more. It is my understanding from advice of counsel that unlike when amending and restated the declaration, a non-response from a mortgagee is considered an affirmative vote. If you utilize another process, we call it the certified mailing process to get first mortgagee approval, yes, a non-response is considered a yes vote. So that is like the only time you're ever going to be able to do that. If quorum is too high, how do you get that changed? Well, again, you're going to have to propose an amendment, and you're going to need to use the full 60-day timeline of a mail ballot vote, and the board will likely need to have some sort of a plan in place for how you're going to divide and conquer the community so that you can get the requisite number of votes in to meet quorum so that you can lower it. What time is it? Oh, we got 3 more minutes. Sorry, let's see. Can you talk more about the EV charging stations and HOA garages? Should owners vote or just the board? Very hot topic. It's going to depend. So if it's a limited common element garage, we have to allow the installation. If it's a general common element, then the homeowner would have to obviously get approval before they could install. But we can't prohibit them in spaces that are owned by the homeowners or that are their limited common elements. We can have some rules governing, of course, safety and the use of electricity and things like that. If all lots cannot physically abide by an RV placement restriction because of the developer design, is the owner obliged to comply? Yes, just like the association is obligated, to enforce the covenants as they are written, regardless of whether they like them or not. Homeowners are obligated to comply with the covenants as they are written, whether they like them or not. And if you can't figure out how to store your RV the way that the declaration says, then it gets stored offsite. Then you can't keep it in the community. That is essentially how it works. Last question. Can you require approval for generators, or do you need to have pre-established rules? You can require approval For wind electric generators, you can't prohibit them. You can have certain rules governing the sound, specific placement, things like that, but you cannot prohibit them when it's on the person's property. So really, we're talking about, a single family detached home that's got a acreage probably to be able to put a real wind electric generator up there. All right, everyone. It is 1 o'clock. I really, really appreciate you joining me today. Please take the survey if you have a minute, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.